Hello, everyone, and welcome to another iteration of the Ziauddin Faculty of Law, Politics and Governance podcast. This is your host, Ali Hassam al-Haq, and with me, as always, is the very brilliant Sir Alexander George Orwell Lawson. Thank you for being here, Professor.
Thank you, Ali.
Of course, it's always a pleasure having a chat with you on topics of international law, which is your specialty. I'll remind the viewers that Sir Alex is the Director for the Center for International and Constitutional Law at Ziauddin University. So today we're going to be talking about development internationally, or rather for a specific country, the United States. They've recently had their presidential elections, which Donald Trump has successfully won with the popular vote as well as the Electoral College.
Yes.
Yeah, with both of them. So a landslide victory in a sense. And the transition of power is meant to be on the second Tuesday of January, I believe.
At the beginning of January, I can't remember the specifics, but yeah.
More or less in that. So they have quite a bit of time before they transition into power. But there's a lot of things to discuss with respect to Donald Trump and his policies regarding administration, governance, international relations, and the general direction that a superpower such as the United States is taking. So, Mr. Lawson, first let's begin with a little bit of a recap of how Trump's first administration went.
Yeah, so Donald Trump, you may remember, was elected president in 2016 and defeated Hillary Clinton, and then was president through to 2020, and then was defeated by Joseph Biden, who is currently the president now. Although Trump has won the election, he's the president-elect, as you say, until January, when it will transition to Trump being president again. And you can only serve 2 terms as US president, so this will be his final term in office. And he's only the second president ever to serve 2 non-consecutive terms after Grover Cleveland, who did it back in the 1800s, who's famous for nothing other than that, basically. Trump's first presidency, there were some interesting foreign policy developments. I always say that a US president has more impact on non-Americans than Americans, because it doesn't really matter who the president is for Americans that much. But foreign policy is an area where a president really does have influence. So there was some, it was generally, I think, isolationist. And I think that's a word that people don't use, but I think it's a word that applies to Trump.
So Trump's philosophy is...
Yeah, his foreign policy philosophy is very what we call realist in international relations. It's very based around what is in the interest of the United States. But his interpretation of those interests is quite narrow. And so he was basically didn't want to get involved in complex treaty negotiations and things like that. Renegotiated some treaties, but really left those untouched largely. And was constantly questioning the value of the NATO alliance, which has always been an absolute commitment to the United States. They never wavered in it. Asking questions about why is it the United States spends more on defense than the other NATO member states spend, which is a legitimate question. And not wanting to get too entangled in foreign endeavors. He did engage in some use of airstrikes in certain parts of the world to achieve specific objectives, and in a sense carried on the Obama administration's approach to that.
Although, if I may, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but there is an important bit of history in there, that although generally he did continue the Obama administration's offensives, but he did try to create an impediment to that. I remember when he took office in his first term, he announced publicly that America has no business interfering in Syria.
Yeah.
And he announced that we will not be intervening in the sort of skirmishes going on in the region. And I think it was 2 or perhaps 3 days, not longer than a week after that announcement, that America fired, I think, 55 Tomahawk missiles into Syria, each costing a couple of $100 million. Was that a sort of Trump U-turn from his policy, or was it the military-industrial complex saying that, look, this is how things are going to be?
This goes to a wider point. I mean, firstly, that's exactly what happened, pretty much. He said, we don't have interest in that area, and then he did use intervention. But I think, firstly, his interventions generally have been quite low-key and quite limited.
Relatively
speaking, he's certainly much less interested in using what we call hard power, which is basically military power, abroad, because he worries about it costing money and not producing tangible results. And it's difficult to see how using airstrikes in Syria produces tangible results for Americans. But I think what happened is that there's an element that his advisors said there are certain things happening we can't let slide, and we need to make some kind of statement. And so Trump did the minimum. He launched some missiles to make a statement, and that was the end of it. The second point, though, about you asked about a U-turn, is Trump doesn't have a consistent mindset, a consistent philosophy. So he's prone to constantly changing his mind. And he's prone to talking a lot and frankly saying things that he doesn't necessarily think through that much. And that was an example of that, where it's a stupid thing to say we're not going to intervene in a place. Why would you even say that? Because just don't do it. And then if you do need to do it, then do it. But just saying we're not going to do it is just a sort of perverse form of just you're creating a difficulty for yourself. You know.
It doesn't align with the norms of international relations and
the basic problem with Trump as a political figure, both domestically and abroad, is that he's just a renegade. He just does not follow the rules. He doesn't follow the rules of a presidential candidate.
Do you think that's what's won him the election for the second time?
I think there's an element that there's, to use an overused word, but authentic. And I think Trump is what you see is what you pretty much expect to get. And I think there's a strong element of that. You know, we're sort of going off into politics here, but yeah, he's real. I mean, he's really a not very pleasant person, as far as one can tell. But he really is that guy. You know?
It does seem that the American public is really responding to, like you said, that authenticity or him being real, and sort of maybe some of them, from what the narratives that have reached me from my colleagues and friends and counterparts in the States, is that a lot of people are responding positively to the return of common sense, as they call it. Specifically, his policy on rolling back on Biden's what he calls gender-affirming care. And he said, "Come on, that's ridiculous. You're putting in all of these toxins and hormonal treatments on kids, boys and girls who really aren't in a position to make that call for themselves. Like things like cigarettes and alcohol are banned, but hormone therapy and these things as such are completely legitimized." So a lot of people do seem to be responding positively to that as well.
That the culture wars might be over. Because I think that the Democrats have to look at themselves and realize that it didn't help them in the slightest. It appeals to a tiny constituency, and it did not get their core vote out, who really just don't care about this kind of stuff that much. It'll be interesting to see what happens in terms of what comes out of Hollywood and other industries in the next 4 years. But I have a sense that this is a turning point because there's been a sort of conscious rejection of a lot of this stuff. It's easy to say that and make bold predictions, but I just get a feeling that those issues are starting to die down.
So it seems. I recently heard a senior member of the Democratic Party saying that we've been using all of these politically correct phrases and words, and they were specifically talking in terms of the Latinx community, and they said that by doing that, we're effectively alienating our entire voter bank. And they said even Latinx people don't identify as Latinx; they just call us Latinos. That's completely fine.
Well, I mean, the Democrats have always been an alliance. The Labour Party in the UK is kind of similar. It's an alliance of a core working class vote that may be strongly unionized, and that's always been associated with the Democrats rather than with the Republicans.
I see.
And also the Hollywood, Taylor Swift crowd. And I think what you've seen is that alliance has broken down, and that many of the working class people who are far more numerous don't feel at home anymore in that Democratic Party, and they don't see they've got anything in common with that. The alliance is gone. Those people have shifted to Trump, and that's again, I think it's the same thing, same kind of thing happened in the Labour Party in the UK.
Right, so that's quite interesting. But we could be talking about this for
the
next couple of hours. But so I'll come back to Donald Trump and his presidency. So, in your opinion, Professor Lawson, how do you think the second term of Trump 2, as you would call it, would differ from, let's say, Trump 1?
Well, I mean, the short answer would be is that I have no idea, in the sense that predicting what Trump does is always difficult. But that's a very flip answer, and I think there is a real answer, which is if you just look for the clues in the first term and things he said in the meantime, a lot of the issues are still the same issues. but there are other things which were not live issues when he was there that have come into existence. We know things he said about them, and you can get an overall sense. So I think it's going to be similar in that you're going to see limited interference in the rest of the world. People will always say, well, they do interfere, but what I mean is he's unlikely to open up any new fronts, right? He's not going to start any new conflicts anywhere. The conflicts they inherited, they'll have to manage. In terms of the specifics, the obvious one that wasn't really a big issue for him was Ukraine and Russia. That happened while Biden was president. But he's been very clear that he wants to stop sending aid to Ukraine. And that he also wants a deal to be put in place. What a senior official said the other day, Crimea is gone, just accept that.
Right.
You know, and that's to be honest, that's pretty understandable. I mean, you can't keep shoveling money down this enormous hole of Ukraine and sending all this aid. It's not going to make a lot of difference in the
You
long
think
run.
they're going to pull back on their?
I think that the United States is basically going to pretty much stop all aid to Ukraine, and I think that other
Perhaps
states,
direct aid, but what about via NATO?
well, NATO doesn't send aid. I mean, it's the states of NATO that send aid. Obviously, they coordinate through their NATO partners. No, I think he's going to stop doing that.
I see.
I think he's going to stop doing it because he regards it as a needless expense, but also it's just prolonging the agony.
I see.
Ukraine cannot win.
Of course, it's a very sort of asymmetric warfare that's
Yeah.
going on in the region. But that leads me to quite an interesting question. That okay, sure, he doesn't see any utility in the Russia-Ukraine conflict to continue, which is quite a bold statement, by the way. But showing, given the fact that he's very, or seems to be very invested in the conflict between Israel and Palestine, given the fact that during his presidency, the American embassy was shifted into Jerusalem.
Yeah.
The American embassy to Israel was shifted to Jerusalem. So it kind of legitimized Israel's occupation.
Yeah,
in the
he
region.
said Israel is the capital of Jerusalem's the capital of Israel as far as he's concerned,
Precisely,
which is
yeah.
what many politicians in Israel argue, including Netanyahu.
Absolutely, yeah. So I mean, that kind of policy, what do you think is going to, is that going to carry on in the region? Is it going to support Israel a bit more? What do you foresee?
The United States politically is solidly pro-Israel, and it really doesn't matter which candidate you pick or which party. It was always going to be solidly Israel, and Trump is very solidly Israel. So he's going to continue with that. I think that there is a sense, and there are some signals from Trump that he wants Israel to stop, the level of violence it's using, and he wants there to be some kind of deal. America, it's not. Everybody notices that he always talks about deals, and I think he believes he could get some kind of deal in the Middle East, but it's probably quite limited. It's a deal to stop this conflict now, and then you can begin reconstruction. Not a comprehensive deal. I think in Ukraine he thinks he can get a comprehensive deal, and he probably can.
He claims to be quite close with Putin.
Well, some people, John Bolton the other day said, former Trump aide who sort of turned against him, but said that Putin thinks he knows how to play Trump. Now, there could be an elaborate double ruse going on in which Trump is playing Putin, but I suspect it is
The other
if anyone's
way around.
playing anybody, it's Putin playing Trump, because I think Putin's probably smarter than Trump.
I think that's safe to say. At
yeah,
least that's where it appears to be.
Yeah, I mean, Trump opens his mouth and says what he thinks, which is why he's popular with voters. Trump doesn't have to worry about Putin doesn't have to worry about being popular with voters. So he will calculate what he says in a way that, is. Putin's never threatened fire and fury. He's alluded to the use of nuclear weapons 1,000 times in the
number of
last couple of
times,
years,
yeah.
but he's never put it in those exact terms. So I think that Ukraine, he thinks he can get a deal. He would love to have a comprehensive deal in the Middle East, but it's not possible.
I mean, so you're saying that he's going to push to try at the very least.
Well, the reason why they abandoned the Iranian nuclear cooperation program, which Obama negotiated and was working until Trump came along and abandoned it, is because Trump felt that it let Iran off the hook, in the sense that he wanted to get Iran to stop backing Hezbollah and other groups, to back off Israel, to basically he thought what he was looking for was a comprehensive Middle East settlement. Whereas Obama took the view that this is a specific problem that we can deal with, stopping Iran from developing a nuclear weapon. Let's deal with it. Trump doesn't like that. He believes that there's a grand solution to everything and he can personally organize it. Whereas Obama was more pragmatic. This is a problem, we can fix it, the problem is fixed.
I mean, let's pick the fruit we can.
Yeah, let's marginal gains,
Yeah.
as they say in sport. We'll make this is a gain. We've stopped this problem, and then maybe eventually we can get somewhere. Whereas Trump felt that what it meant was that the Iranian administration no longer had oil sanctions. It could buy stuff that it wanted to buy that it couldn't previously, airliners and things like that from Europe, and he was like, in his eyes, Iran was still a problem. Well, he's right. In America's eyes, it was still a problem. But Obama is practical enough to, take what you can get. You know, we can achieve this. Let's achieve this, and let's work on the other thing tomorrow. Right.
I see. So we do see some differences between the security-related policies of the Biden administration and the Obama administration compared with the Trump administration. But I'd like to move a little bit towards the economic kind of superpowers that are opposing America. And maybe there is an element of military there. I'd like to talk about China. And of course, the military aspect is there with Taiwan and the South China Sea, of course. But there's also a huge economic sort of factor there. And we've seen Trump being very vocal about China and, putting trade embargoes and perhaps some tariffs or some other things that artificially elevate the price of imported goods. So what do you think that is that economic policy that he had in his first term going to continue? Is he going to crack down on it harder? Is he going to work towards American local manufacturing? And if so, how will he deal with the price advantage that other countries have trading with China?
Yeah, I think it's going to continue. I mean, I think he's already he has promised some like continuation tariffs and stuff, more tariffs. But what I think is interesting is that the fact that Biden was a single-term president meant that, and the Democrats single terms, it would have been Harris obviously, but she lost, means that a lot of the stuff Trump put in place kind of carried on in the Biden administration, because that's the way it works. It carries on for a while and then you change it. And so some of it's still operating for when Trump was around, some of the agreements. But also, I think in terms of the overall argument that Trump was making about China, he won that argument in American politics. The Democrats adopted it. The Democrats took the view that China is an existential threat, and that particularly in terms of the trade imbalance, it was a threat, and therefore that you should be defending American industry against China. The main way they wanted to do it, rather than tariffs, was as you said, you alluded to, what we call onshoring, which is bringing back businesses that had previously gone abroad back to America and giving tax incentives to that. And that's happened quite a lot during Trump's first administration and Biden's administration.
I think the biggest example is of Apple moving their manufacturing away from China.
It's the chip war, it's microchips. Microchips are so completely essential to everything nowadays, and they're mostly made in China, and that's dangerous because you can't control that market, and so every product nowadays just about has a microchip in it.
Yeah.
Even in the West, things like drinks cartons have RFID tags in them. Which they're very very cheap throwaway, but they have those tags in them,
right?
So that they can link in with smart fridges for the 5 people who own a smart fridge. Right. So I think that debate has almost been won. If you look at what happened when there were debates about allowing the Chinese telecommunications companies to run 5G networks in America and the West, that's dead.
Absolutely.
That's just not allowed because it's perceived that they would potentially be controlled by China, and China says it's racism, but pretty much everywhere has taken that view. Britain's taken the same view.
No, but it is a cybersecurity threat, of course. If somebody's manufacturing your equipment and sure, the samples they give may not have backdoors in them, but the actual products might.
Yeah.
And Wi-Fi has the capability of actually mapping out entire rooms that it's placed inside, and it can detect, if it has the right hardware, how many humans are in the room, what's their placement, generally speaking, in reference to the Wi-Fi router. And
Yeah.
if you have access to that information, it's kind of like almost like having a CCTV camera in your house, which is a bit blurry, but you can generally make out what's going on.
Well, I think that the main fear as well is just that in the event of some kind of crises, China might decide just to shut down. You know,
Yeah.
the Chinese, basically the Chinese Communist Party tell, I can never say the name of the Chinese company, begins with an H,
Yeah.
tell them to just shut down this communication network in Britain. And that's just total chaos then.
Yeah.
You can't communicate, can't do anything about a crisis. Now, whether that's true or not, because obviously those companies argue we're just private companies. We're not under the Chinese control, Chinese government control. I don't know. I'm just saying that's the paranoia.
That's what it appears to be.
Yeah, that's
absolutely.
the
Yeah. So as commentators, that is our role, just to see what the general consensus is, what it appears to be. Because obviously a lot of these things aren't set in stone, they're not established as fact. We don't have the relevant authorities guaranteeing that such is the case.
Yeah.
And so we can only analyze.
We just don't know whether those companies in fact are run with minimal interference. And if they are, then there wouldn't be a problem.
Yeah.
But we know that people are paranoid about it.
Yeah.
And again, you know, this level of paranoia existed before pages were exploding.
Yeah.
Now you've got the added layer of paranoia. Is what if, you know, somebody starts putting some kind of dangerous device into these phones?
Absolutely.
You know, which is, you know, again, is not very realistic, but it's enough to get people in the U.S. Senate agitated.
But let's say they don't even put a physically, harmful device. What if it's all about the control of data or the parsing or scraping of data? Because we know the NSA has done so in the past, so they understand the potential that exists in terms of data collection and analyzing that data. And obviously, they don't want to give that kind of insight or control to a foreign entity or a foreign government, if that, whatever the case might be, for local American citizens. And I mean, you know, it goes to show their policies aligned with that as well. And it also goes to show that they banned TikTok in America, which is a huge global platform. And their entire claim, some of the commentators claim that it's all about narrative control. They didn't want a foreign-owned app to have that kind of influence on the mindset of American citizens. And you know, all of these things are interlinked. They do have an economic aspect to it, but they also have a military aspect to it or a security aspect to it. But as you said, this is a legitimate concern that a lot of people have in their minds when we're talking about America. But speaking of concerns, a very big concern of Trump, or at least one of the talking points that he used in his first campaign, was the amount of illegal immigration and the influx of illegal immigrants into the territory of the United States, undocumented, so on and so forth. How do you think, and of course, building the border wall, you know, which he said Mexico is going to pay for it, but then obviously we know how that went. So how do you think the immigration policy is going to develop now that he's taking office again a second time?
I think it's alongside the economy, which is always a number one issue, and that's baffling as to why Harris's campaign didn't make more of the economy. And Bill Clinton, it's the economy stupid, right? And that was only 30 years ago. People should remember that. And that's, you know, a Democrat president who won 2 terms quite convincingly. Alongside the economy, immigration was probably the banner issue in the whole thing. Because firstly, people want to feel that there's money in their pocket more than there would be with another person. But also immigration is tied up with that because people are worried about immigration lowering wages, basically. You know, if an illegal immigrant doesn't get paid. America has a minimum wage, illegal immigrant do it for $10, and you won't hire me for $25. But in terms of what he's promised is deportations, which is kind of different than the first term. The first term was, well, I will stop any more people from arriving. And now it's, I will stop people from arriving and I will start deporting people. I think that there are going to be a lot of barriers to achieving this because there are all kinds of rights concerns that the United States will have to face, lots of legal actions. You're not going to see anybody deported for about 2 or 3 years. And then you're towards the end of his presidency anyway. But I think it's an issue that most Americans are on Trump's side on. Unfortunately for the Democrats, they never really got a grasp on this, and you could always find statistics that showed that levels of immigration were just going up, that they weren't being dealt with. Plus, the Democrats never really articulated a sensible position. There have been amnesties previously in America, where the president's position has been, we'll just grant everybody citizenship, right? There's 2 million people, let's just give them citizenship. Now they're legal, now they're paying tax, saves all kinds of costs for the state. But the problem is you can do that, you can't keep doing it, because you're just incentivizing more people to come. They think, I'll go illegally and then the president will give you an amnesty. So you have to deal with this issue. And I'm hesitant in the way I talk about it, because we've almost been raised in the West to say if you talk about immigration, you're automatically taking a position on it. But Americans are genuinely concerned about this issue. And until the Democrats give the impression that they're concerned about it, they probably can't win an election, right? So the answer is, I think that there will be removals, deportations, but not as it's not going to be as easy as people think.
But isn't that already the law and the job of the ICE to be tracking them down and deporting them?
Yes, but at the moment I think there's an element of which that people are being tracked down but not being removed.
I see.
And it gets very complicated because America usually gives nationality on birth, and you get the problem of what if your parents are there illegally, but you were born there? That can't be right, that you therefore get nationality. But it's interesting that one of the things you mentioned, and you said ICE, which is Immigration Customs Enforcement, there are so many US agencies that are responsible for this area that they don't talk to each other enough. And that creates an institutional problem, and is one of the reasons why. There's, it's not just ICE, it's the Department of State, there's Homeland Security get involved. If it's a drugs problem, and
Border Patrol as well.
Border Patrol, DEA, FBI, obviously, local police. You end up with like 7 agencies all having their say. And then, of course, on the side of all this, you've got lawyers acting pro bono for this group, basically saying, well, you can't send them back where they came from because they're going to face persecution. And if that is true, then that's a breach of the asylum-seeking rules and the United Nations Refugee Convention.
But does that apply? Because are these people who are immigrating actually seeking asylum or
if they can show, they're probably not. But once it gets to the point that most of them are just moving for economic reasons. But once it gets to the point they're removed, they will then make those arguments, and they can make those arguments. It doesn't matter that you got there illegally. So if they can say, I can't go back to Mexico because, just believable but simple lie. There's a drug lord, I owe him $1,000, he will kill me. Then that would be a basis for granting an asylum claim if it was genuine.
This is the first example of seeing over-enforcement being the problem here.
Well, it's a problem America's always had, in that if you go back to lots of incidences like the famous Branch Davidian compound that was stormed. With David Koresh, was this leader who said he was the second coming of Jesus and stuff, and he was running it. It was a cult, basically. It was a cult. And the reason why that was such a disaster is because the agencies weren't talking to each other, so no one really knew what was going on. And then, when 9/11 happened, they introduced new agencies. You don't need that many, you just need 2. You need the FBI and a border agency, right? But the problem is that as much as Trump likes to be a rebel and kind of ignore the rules of the system, he's not going to be able to get around the fact that there are these rules, right? And in the end, a lawyer can go and ask for a injunction from a judge, and the judge will probably be minded early on to give those injunctions and to say you cannot remove these people until the following thing has happened. And then suddenly it's 6 months later and nobody's moved. Plus, it's going to be expensive as well. Somebody estimated that it might cost $1,000 per person you removed. And if that's true,
$2 billion.
At least $2 billion. I suspect that's a very optimistic
figure. Yeah, of
figure.
course, I
think
agree.
It's probably going to be even more than that.
There's a huge sort of logistical problem with making sure that if you are removing families, at least they should be together. Because there was a huge mess in his first administration about children being separated from their parents, families being split apart, and a huge outcry of human rights activists as well that this is completely inhumane.
The problem is these produce very emotive images, which, if you really want to make a solid policy, you shouldn't care about those images, but it does produce them.
All right, so that makes sense. Do you think he's going to sort of cater to these concerns this time around?
He doesn't really have much choice. The alternative, I mean, he's got to. These are the systems in place. The alternative is to try and get Congress to pass some laws on the question that directly deal with it. But that's still not going to get around the fact that the Constitution is going to provide protections, and that's going to be there. The judiciary are not going to want to be excluded from this.
Naturally.
And it might be easy to say that, well, they're illegal, so they're illegal Mexicans, so they don't have constitutional rights. But the problem is that there might be some of them in there who are entitled to be in the United States, who have been pushed into that group. If you deport 10,000 people and 2 of them claim we're American citizens, you've got the wrong guy, you've got the wrong Mr. Lopez, then that becomes an issue that the judge is going to say, well, I can't risk that you're going to send 2 Americans off to back to Mexico, or not back to Mexico, to Mexico. So we have to go through all the processes. And the only way around that was to change the Constitution itself, which is practically impossible. So I think you're going to see lots of judicial safeguards. And I think that, funnily enough, it's one of the problems with the American system is that projects often take longer than the presidency. There are a few projects that take 4 years. And the problem in Trump's case is that he didn't have 8 years together. So a lot of presidents would be like, well, this is something we can do in year 6. Trump hasn't got year 6, he's only got 4 more years.
Right.
He didn't do these things in the first term, and even if he did, Biden came in and got in the way. So I'd be surprised if there were that many deportations. The next question is, who's the next president going to be?
And what policies will they come up with?
But I still stand by my comment that I just think the Democrats have to get a grip on this. They have to stop being seen as being a party that's lax on this issue, because it's an issue that pretty much unifies the voters.
I see. So do you think this entire philosophy, so what I can gather from Trump's sort of decisions and policies in his first term, as well as your analysis now leading into his second term, is that he's very nationalistic. He wants what's best in America's interests. He wants the people to be doing well. He wants there to be economic and financial sort of,
almost self-sufficiency more, which is what isolationism.
Absolutely, isolationism. And so does this also lead into his policy regarding trade and protectionism, for that matter?
Well, the way I describe Trump's philosophy is, funnily enough, not actually describing his philosophy, it's describing what he isn't, because I think it's easier to describe what he isn't than what he is. Liberal multilateralism is over. That was what Obama stood for, and Biden to a certain degree. The idea that you could solve the world's problems by everybody just sitting down talking, and globalization would make everybody rich, and therefore you didn't need to worry about carving things up because it didn't matter. You didn't need to protect America's piece of the pie. You could just make the pie so much bigger that relatively it would appear bigger, if you see what I mean. Right? You could make the world twice as wealthy. You don't need to worry about America specifically. Americans will get wealthier. And I think what Trump is saying is that that's just unrealistic. That there are winners and there are losers. That's the logic of deal making, if you think about it, which is what Trump always says he is. There are winners and there are losers. You try and get the best deal you can for the American people, and that implies a worse deal for other people. And I think that kind of explains him. It's what he isn't, which is he doesn't believe that everything's going to be resolved by just liberalizing markets and that kind of thing, and opening up things for it. I mean, he actually kept NAFTA. NAFTA is pretty much intact. It's called something else now, but it's pretty much the same, which is the North American Free Trade Agreement. But that kind of makes sense within the confines of the continental, Americas. So I think that his approach to trade is going to be, yes, protectionism. I mean, he's kind of got a point, because for a long time China got away with a lot of stuff in international trade. It maybe doesn't do all of those things now, but Trump is saying, well, they were able to. Things like not respecting intellectual property, which they have a bad record with. But I think he's going to um, be aggressive with China. The interesting thing is that we're talking about foreign policy. The only way that foreign policy ever benefits you is if you're nasty to foreigners. If you do anything nice for them, that doesn't help. So Trump always thinks it's his job to be nasty to foreigners. That's the only way he's going to get any votes out of it. And,
I mean, he's seen the example with Canada as well, who were very welcoming initially, and now they're actually, asking people to leave, go back,
Yeah.
refusing immigration applications because it just didn't work out to import an entire workforce, and at every level, not just blue collar, but also white collar workers, and that didn't make sense. So I suppose they're trying to emulate or learn from the mistake of their neighbors so that they don't do that in America. I think today has been quite a fruitful discussion with respect to Trump, and a lot of very interesting things I learned as well today from your expertise. So I certainly hope that it's good news for the rest of the world as well that Trump is taking office once again for a second time. Hopefully, some of the skirmishes and wars will be pulled back, diminished, decreased, something of that nature. But I suppose that's yet to be seen. So thank you very much, Professor Lawson, for being here today, for sort of enlightening our audience with your expertise, with your analysis, and hopefully see you all in the next episode.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. Goodbye.